Our first speaker is Susan Christopherson. She is a professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. She will be speaking about how should we think about the economic consequences of shale gas drilling. She is an economic geographer, whose research focuses on economic policy and economic development. Much of her scholarship in the field of economic development has examined strategies for revitalizing the New York State economy. And in May 2010, she received grants from the Park Foundation and the Heinz Endowments to direct a study on the economic development consequences of hydro-fracturing natural gas drilling in the Marcellus Shale, and so that, which will be of interest to us today. The second speaker today is Thomas Murphy, and he is the extension educator and co-director of the Penn State Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research at Penn State University. He will be speaking about Marcellus Shale impacts to Pennsylvania and its communities. He brings with him today more than 25 years of experience working with landowners, researchers, industry, government agencies, and public officials during his tenure with the outreach branch of the university. His work has been namely in the realm of educational consultation in natural resource development, with an emphasis specifically in natural gas exploration and related topics. Following Tom, our third speaker will be Hannah Weissman. She is an assistant professor in the College of Law at Florida State University, and she will be speaking about fracturing regulation applied. She received her JD, her law degree, from Yale Law School in 2007. Following graduation from law school, she clerked for Judge Patrick Higginbotham of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. She teaches in the areas of energy law, environmental law, property, and land use. Her recent scholarship focuses on shale gas development and hydraulic fracturing regulation. And then our final speaker for this afternoon's session is Simona Perry. She is a research scientist at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and she will be speaking about fractured communities, fractured lives, psychological, social, and political consequences of rapid shale gas development in Pennsylvania's Endless Mountains. She received her PhD from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where she conducted ethnographic fieldwork in Boston. From 2009 to 2011, Dr. Perry was the Mellon postdoctoral scholar at Dickinson College, where she began a participatory rural mapping project within the Susquehanna, I'm not going to pronounce it today, river watershed that now has become a long-term study in the cultural and community changes taking place as a result of shale natural gas development in northeastern Pennsylvania. And as at the end of the last session, as some of the panelists said, or maybe what took place at the end, was that this session we're actually moving away from some of the science to more of the socioeconomic setting, but also really bringing communities into the discussion and looking at the people who are impacted by gas drilling in the United States, shale gas drilling and hydraulic fracturing. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan to begin.
Thank you, Erica. I feel like this is a new version of speed dating. I'm having to talk about the consequences, the economic consequences of shale gas drilling in 12 minutes. Is a challenge, I have to say. But I will try to meet this challenge and try not to talk too fast. What we've been hearing about this morning really is the place where the controversies have focused in the last several years, and that's on water. And in New York, where I come from, and in Pennsylvania, these controversies are extremely live. There's a very, very active debate in New York where we're considering the revised draft standardized supplemental generic impact statement. They've received 16,000 comments on the draft now and are expecting more. Today's the deadline, so if you want to get your comments in, today's the day. Most of the attention has focused on the issues we heard about this morning, on the water issues. And what I'm going to talk about is another set of questions. And these questions are important because in some ways they're posed as the alternative, the trade-off. The trade-off, and we heard this morning from the dean, the trade-off is assumed to be one in which we have strong, consistent economic development from shale gas drilling. And what I want to talk about today is the research I've been doing for the last couple of years that doesn't say that we aren't going to have some kind of economic growth from shale gas drilling, but raises some qualifications about that growth and some things that we have to think about in our states and localities when we think about the economic consequences. In particular, I'm going to talk about some of the local costs that affect the communities in which shale gas drilling occurs, particularly public costs, there are fiscal costs. I'm also going to talk about costs that are associated with the industrial landscape that emerges with shale gas drilling. A landscape that is quite extensive, but is composed of activities that are very, very capital intensive. That is that they don't employ very many people. Shale gas drilling is an activity that is very capital intensive. It's very risky, it's very speculative, and it doesn't actually employ that many people. The economic growth that we see from it occurs during the boom period. Third, I want to talk a bit about the questions that have to do with the long-term consequences of shale gas drilling, particularly the association of any kind of extraction and including shale gas drilling and hydraulic fracturing with what's called the resource curse, the boom-bust cycle, and the fact that when the resource is depleted, it's gone. And then you have to look at what happens to the regions in which that kind of extraction has taken place. So for the most part, the impacts, the economic impacts of shale gas drilling and hydraulic fracturing have been measured by input-output studies. Someone mentioned to me that North Carolina is now doing a study of shale gas drilling. And I would probably bet maybe like Mitt Romney at $10,000, maybe $10, that study is probably based on an input-output model. Now, input-output models have their uses, but they are models. They give us projections. They're based on assumptions about where expenditures are going to occur. You'll never find a negative input-output model. They don't tell you about costs. They tell you about what kinds of multipliers you're going to get from investments. So when you look at these input-output models, you have to go back to the assumptions and find out what the creators of the input-output models thought about where the expenditures, for example, royalties to the landowners or the drilling crews' wages, where they were going to be spent. If the drilling crew lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or in Texas, they're going to spend their money there. So there are a lot of assumptions that go into these input-output models, and they're very rarely presented when the model is presented to us and the projections are made about employment and taxes. This is just a word to the wise. We have to look at these models and at their limitations. They also do not consider the boom-bust cycle of hydraulic fracturing. They're essentially static models that look at what kinds of jobs are going to be created during the entire phases of exploration, construction, drilling and then the end of the resource development. Now, why are we concerned with these kinds of issues? Why should this be important to us? One is that, as Erica mentioned, and other people have talked about too, the long-term outcomes for the places where drilling takes place are not particularly favorable. So when we look at these particularly rural counties, rural regions, they typically end up worse off than when they started. And there are good reasons for for this happening. This isn't rocket science. The industry the activities tend to crowd out other industries. They compete with it for labor. Cost of living rises. There are these negative impacts over time that in fact make the economies of these rural regions less diverse, and they end up also with smaller populations at the end of this process. So we have to be very careful in looking at where the expenditures are going to be made and what that effect that's going to have on different kinds of places. I was very disappointed that Art Berman wasn't here this morning because I was really depending on him to set up some basic ideas about how we have to think about shale gas drilling. That really the cumulative impact of shale gas drilling depends upon how many wells are drilled in an area and over what time period. So he's written a lot about what drives the pace and scale of drilling. This is a very contentious issue because there are questions about the extent to which the commercial interests, the financial interests in the industry determine how fast the drilling will occur, whether companies, for example, have to take advantage of the fact that they have leases, and what kinds of strategies companies are going to use to either speed up or slow down drilling or to move from one gas drilling play to another. And they can do that within a fairly short period of time and have done it, for example, in the Bakken Shale or in the Jonah Field in Colorado. And so you'll get an interim boom-bust cycle too. This creates the kinds of problems that communities face economically and fiscally with shale gas drilling. So these are some of the local costs of shale gas drilling that occur during the boom period, the construction period, the period when the growth occurs. Among these costs are, one we've heard a lot about, road maintenance. As someone mentioned this morning, this is a very truck-intensive industry, so there are approximately, and I think this is varying now depending upon whether the companies are using recycled water, but there can be an average of 1,000 truck trips per well, so you get a lot of traffic congestion, road use, impact on bridges, those kinds of costs to the public. Higher public safety costs, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Increased demand for health and education services. If people move into a region, they will bring their children, and there will be demands on the schools. There's been an interesting study done in northern Pennsylvania in a hospital that has assessed the impact on the health services they can provide that have accelerated during the drilling period. For example, having to hire translators, having to deal with the kinds of injuries that they didn't have to deal with before, having more demand on their emergency services. So there are those kinds of demands. Increased demand on public administrative services. And this is, if you talk to public officials in New York State or Pennsylvania, they've been spending all their time on shale gas drilling for the last 2 years. So this is also a demand on the energy and time of public officials. And finally, new kinds of service requirements such as emergency response capacity, environmental monitoring and remediation that may occur either at the local level or at the state level. This is just to give you an example of the kind of costs that may happen in a community. This is the same road. A student of mine took this picture at 2 different times of year. Now, this has been considered somewhat hyperbolic because a critic of this picture said, well, there's winter. That's a consequence of winter. And I thought to myself, well, yes, in Pennsylvania and New York, we do have winter. And this is the effect of having roads overused and also of winter, the fact that you do have this kind of demand on the roads from intensive heavy truck traffic. So this is a question, again, of how we'll pay for these costs. This, in a study of Sublette County in Wyoming, a Cornell researcher also looked at the question of public safety costs. And I'm doing right now, using FBI data, an analysis across shale plays of increases in arrests. It's very, very difficult to get data across shale plays on this kind of subject, of costs and impacts. But one that there is data on is arrests. This is an example of arrests that increased in Sublette County. Again, this is a consequence of increased population and an increase in the population of young men. So I would say there's a cause-effect relationship here, but they did have to hire more police. That's what's the consequence. Second, there's this question of the regional industrial landscape. And one of the things that we see a lot of in the studies that are done about shale gas drilling is, and this is necessary, absolutely, focus on the well site itself. But there's an industrial landscape that goes along with shale gas drilling, and that has long-term implications for the regions where shale gas drilling occurs. And again, I would say that the activities that occur in this industrial landscape are very significant. They include things like man camps, water extraction sites, compressor plants, pipelines, staging areas, rail spurs, gas storage sites, and processing facilities for produced water. So what we get is an industrial landscape, again with truck traffic. This kind of landscape is very inconsonant with certain kinds of industries, or appears to be, at least from what we know, particularly certain kinds of agriculture like dairy farming and tourism. So we have to look at, again, at how this kind of industrial landscape is going to interact with the industries that we already have. New York State is a very important dairy state, and is also a very important tourism state. So the question we might ask is, and we should ask, are we going to create enough long-term jobs to make up for the jobs that we may lose in tourism and dairy farming, and then in dairy processing? So the third area that I think is important, and I'll finish, is that there's a considerable literature that points to the fact that the rural regions, the rural counties, dependent on natural resource extraction, have poor development outcomes. They tend to lose population, they have less diverse economies, and they have higher levels of income inequality. This is true for counties in Pennsylvania and New York that have had vertical natural gas drilling. They are among the poorest counties in those states, and they are actually at a disadvantage economically because of the less diverse economies they have than other similar counties that have not had drilling in those states. So we need to ask again about the kinds of trade-offs that are going to be made over the long term. So just to kind of give us some idea of how we might think about this in terms of policy, one of the things, and I think this is happening to some extent in New York, inadvertently in some ways, is a question of slowing the process down so that people can adjust to it and can actually understand in a more comprehensive way what the consequences are going to be for their communities and address them. Transparency is very important. Pennsylvania has been reasonably good about that, allowing people to understand where drilling is going to occur and at what pace. Planning across governments to minimize negative impacts from the industrial infrastructure, so every individual community doesn't have to deal with this by itself, making, for example, doing road agreements and anticipating what kinds of damages are going to be done to the roads. And then being proactive in planning for ways to use this resource more effectively. If there's going to be natural gas drilling, it shouldn't simply be exported. It should also be used to build industrial capacity in the places where the drilling occurs. So I think that and there have to be plans in place to do that. It isn't just a nice wish to have, but this has to be something that is planned for. So what I would say finally is that when we talk about this, we need to think about the long-term consequences, which in a boom-bust industry have not been good for the regions where it occurs. The economic benefits in terms of jobs have tended to be inflated, and there are not as many jobs that are being created in Pennsylvania as have been predicted by the input-output studies. And then there are significant costs to communities from this process. So thank you very much. I'm not sure how you exit from this.
Yeah, we have the IP.
Oh, good.
I'll just have you do it faster than I will. Thank you. Great. And while we're waiting to start the next presentation, again, if you have questions, please jot them down on one of those pieces of papers that students are walking around with, and we'll collect them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good afternoon. Tom Murphy with Penn State University and with the Marcellus Center at the university. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things, actually a number of similar points that Susan was talking about, maybe with a different perspective and some of the things that we're seeing inside Pennsylvania. I would mention that I've been lecturing and speaking about some of the impacts we're seeing for quite some time. I see it in a very professional kind of way as we do this kind of work, as we're involved with it as a university. But I'd also highlight, and some here know that this to be the case, I also live in a community. I live in where this Marcellus is actually occurring. So this is something that, along with being a professional interest and something that I speak about, is something that I have a personal interest in and see a lot of these impacts that we'll talk about and that Susan related to in a very personal kind of a way. Friends and family and associations and interactions you have within those same communities. So again, that might be of some interest to some here. We are also going to talk about, and Susan had mentioned about some of the changes that we're seeing out there. Again, this is about impacts. I see this as a convergence between several things, a convergence in the geology and the economics, the social components, the community impacts or issues that would be associated with it. All those things kind of come together, and I'll speak to those as we go through it. And one of those, even as the picture would illustrate, we see the impact or the difference it's making in something in one of our industries that's very large in Pennsylvania, actually being our largest industry, and that being agriculture. And we're seeing some transition there. We don't see agriculture going away, we see agriculture on a transition. And quite frankly, it's not just due to this industry, because we've worked in this realm for a long time, it's due to the economics that are in the dairy industry as a whole, or in agriculture as a whole. So it's several things, again, that confluence of several points coming together. We developed this particular graphic that we keep updating because we think it's a nice illustration of what Susan was talking about, and that is the pace. Very often in discussions that I'm involved in, it's, this is moving too fast or it's moving too slow. And I think this type of a map or this type of an animation actually illustrates just exactly how quick that is going and the number of wells that are being drilled. And maybe even more importantly, as we think about some of those community impacts or some of those social impacts and interactions that are occurring out there, where are they happening in the state and where do we need to plan for that? Where do we need to put things in place in the infrastructure, be it the healthcare industry that again, Susan referenced, or job growth or job training or hotel builds or a variety of other, you think about road maintenance and again, a variety of other things that were mentioned. This gives an illustration, but we're also going to talk as I go through this about a shifting that we're seeing and why that might be important in the discussion as well. So that gives us an idea over the course of several years of what we've seen here in Pennsylvania, in the Marcellus. A different illustration, some folks down in Texas that have cranked through some of this publicly available data. You can see the source in the bottom. We get it from DEP. And they've highlighted this in a graph that I think is very illustrative of exactly where that is. And you can see a lot of that's in that northeastern, north central part of the state. A dry gas zone, so to speak. A little bit about the geology there. But we're seeing, as a previous speaker had talked about today, that we're seeing some type of a shift in the economics towards other areas out there within the state and states around us as the economics of developing not necessarily shale gas, but dry shale gas are changing. With low gas prices, that really is making quite a difference. So right now, with the moment that we've seen up to this point, with prices that we've seen up to this point, with the economics that have driven this picture up to this point, and with leasing and a variety of other considerations, including pipeline and takeaway capacity, and some of that other infrastructure piece that really is critical in understanding what has occurred within Pennsylvania anyway, and quite frankly could potentially be the case in the southern tier in New York if that comes to bear over time. But we see through some of the information that the feds are cranking out and trying to work through what's happening and what the moment is out there, that a lot of this has occurred in that northeastern, north central part of the state because of pipeline that was in the ground. It's also due to geology. We can't discount that. And a variety of other factors, but pipeline being a big part of that, and hence the emphasis that I'm going to place on that going forward. So we get a little bit of an idea as to where gas is being developed, again, as we look at northeastern part of the United States. We see this, and you look at this and say, well, that's all about geology, Tom, and that maybe isn't really what the focus is in this particular session, but I think it is. Because the ramifications of not just the Marcellus, which is maybe the emphasis of my point, but it's really about all the other shales, and it's about how long, and trying to answer the question that Susan was posing, how long is this going to be going on? What is that boom period, that extraction period? And that extraction period then leads to some of those community impacts or some of those social implications that have been referred to here several times. So we need to understand then what the resource is. And the resource, quite frankly, is a lot more than the Marcellus. Companies are finding that some of the other shales out there are as productive, and in some cases more productive or more economically productive than even the Marcellus, certainly more so than even that north central, northeastern part of the state, where a lot of that work is being done right now. So I place a lot of emphasis because I'm going to show you right now that there's some shift going on. And that shift then can lead to some of that, those dynamics that again were referenced in a previous notation that was made. So the black on the right or the left-hand side there, those black zones are some of those other shale beds. And as you look at some of the other states that are around, companies again are finding that some of these other shales, other than their initial target, are becoming as productive as maybe what their initial target might have been. In Pennsylvania, we're seeing this shift towards the Utica. And we're seeing it because of these natural gas liquids, which the economics in developing natural gas liquids to industry are a lot higher. So again, that leads then to this shift or this change in a lot of the infrastructure that's out there, a lot of the people, obviously, even some of the water treatment systems, certainly drill rigs and a variety of other components. They're on rubber, they're on wheels, and they can be moved from place to place. So where the economics are more favorable, depending upon a variety of other factors. It's not strictly what is the price of gas at any one moment. There's a lot of other things that feed into that, but certainly price is a factor. And as the economics change, we'll see some slow shifting over time. Well, why is that important? Well, if a community in north central, northeastern part of the state started to ramp up and build infrastructure in terms of people or housing or whatever, and all of a sudden then a shift started to occur, and it occurred over a period of time, what might have been being built in one area of the state then might start to subside over time. Those are trends that we watch. Those are trends that we're very interested in. And those are trends that we're looking at as we think about the bust side. So if this is an extractive industry that has a boom-bust cycle to it, is it a rapid boom-bust? Is it a boom with a very long tail? Or is it a boom with a tail that can be modified or mitigated somehow to eliminate that bust through other types of things that we'll talk about here in a second? So different scenarios. We also look at this, again, we think about the impacts. We're concerned, or I'm concerned, again, even as an individual or private resident, well, what are the aesthetics of this, or what are the implications of this very long term? And we see change. And a lot of the concern that people have, certainly from that social side, or some of the angst that's in that discussion, is clearly about change. And when you see lots of pipelines go in, or lots of trucks on the road, that all adds to change that people weren't accustomed to. So emphasis in the slide, when we look at some of these large transmission projects and make a distinction between gathering systems that are connecting wells and compressors to the transmission system that's taking it off to the marketplace. And there's a lot of these transmission systems and components that are being put in place. And right now we're seeing that, that FERC, or those that the feds that regulate that part, they're looking at about half of those projects in the country right now that are in motion at some level are dealing with Marcellus or with the shale development that's occurring in that northeast part of the state. So again, that is nationwide. Half of those projects are dealing with Marcellus. So to help answer the question, well, is this a big deal? Is it going to go on for a while? It represents billions of dollars of capital that's being expended, and certainly a lot of process that's going into that as well. Again, the feds are cranking through this. They're looking, and this is a pretty easy illustration to walk through. You can see where the price of gas is and what the trend is. Looking, you know, they calculate this out for home heating fuel or natural gas, or, you know, a variety of other sources, electricity and prices for that. We think about heat and about overall costs. And you can see it at snapshots in time where the price of gas is trending. So we think about the pros and cons of this development. Clearly there's environmental impacts, there's truck impacts like I talked about, but there's also economic impacts in a favorable way when you see that residents that are buying either electric or buying natural gas to heat their homes or factories or whatever it might be are seeing or enjoying the prices that are declining. So again, there are a number of facts that go a variety of different directions as we look at this. Last one from the feds, that again, something more recently they came out with and something we've been tracking, they just made a quicker graph than we did, was future prices. Where is the price of gas likely to be? A number of speakers have talked about the price of gas today being being low, and actually it's sub $3 right now. So it's actually at a very low rate, a very low price, and the projections you can see are in that sub $4 range for most locations in the country. And that's looking at over 12 months. Now those are projections, or they're actually futures prices, but it gives you some kind of an idea as to where the investment community thinks that with the volume of gas coming onto the marketplace, where a price will be over the course of time, and you start to look at projections that go out further, and that leads then to industry, other industries beyond the extraction industry, other industries looking at it from a utilization standpoint. And quite frankly, I think that's where the next big part of the story is, and actually goes back to something that Susan was saying. Again, we think about that boom-bust and the three different scenarios that I painted earlier. I think from what we're seeing that the utilization piece is really that looking over the horizon, looking and trying to mitigate, is there a bust in this cycle, or is it something that's going to have a long tail? So it's not just the extraction side and how long that goes, but is there a utilization piece? Is industry going to come in and start manufacturing like was referenced? Are we going to see other uses of that gas, all of which we're starting to see right now? We do research with a variety of entities, including a lot of large energy-using firms, plastics, paper, steel, things of that nature, and they're looking at siting plants or refashioning plants because of a more predictable and a lower cost price of that same energy source at this point. Power the same way, and we're seeing a number of those, but we look at a variety of factors, and I think all those are important. I think, again, there was a reference made about what the impact looks like on the landscape. I think you need to be also looking at, well, what does this build, the utilization piece, what will that look like on the landscape? So we build more steel mills, or we build the commercial development around that. What will all that equate to as well? All those are important pieces. And some trends that we think about power, and again, you know, the feds are, as I mentioned, are cranking out some of this. We see less coal being used in the state of Pennsylvania. We see more gas being used. We see more of the renewables, wind in particular, not so much in solar, but we see more wind generation capacity going in, including, again, right in an area where I live. But we see the power utilization for natural gas definitely trending up. I mentioned about pipeline. The gathering line is something we see a lot going in. We look at that and we have concerns, or we see issues there as it deals with, number one, what is the change to the landscape? What is the change when we think about the agricultural piece? What is the change when we think about the aesthetics? And can some of that be mitigated so that the tourism impact that Susan was referencing is not a negative impact, or maybe not as negative as it potentially could be? And there's already some studies out there that are dealing with some of this that maybe we can reference in some of the Q&A. So again, those are some of the important pieces, but certainly we want to be thinking about that industrialization component and what does it look like. And even in the picture, you know, the two that I'm illustrating that with, in that top picture, that's not a pond, but that's actually a well pad below that barn. Or that farm that has pipelines going across it. Are they being done in the most beneficial way when we think about the terminal use of that property going forward several generations, not just here at this moment in time? So all those are very important. There's been references made, including from me, about the amount of truck traffic. And this chart actually breaks out on the left-hand side. You can see the number of trucks in the green and the red at the number of total vehicles or cars, essentially. And then over a 5-year run, and then on the right-hand side, get my sides right, turn around, you can see the amount of traffic and how that increase has occurred. And this is in 4 different snapshots in Bradford County. And if you remember back to the beginning, if you're familiar with Pennsylvania, Bradford County is actually the most drilled-in county right now. So we often will use that as a reference, and you'll hear some other references to it today. But lots of traffic. There's no question that that's a major impact that we're seeing out there. And if we're looking at a major downside, the amount of traffic is certainly one of those downsides. What we are seeing, the flip side of that, is municipalities that have put into motion agreements to deal with or mitigate or to be able to work through the process of those trucks coming in and dealing with the roads. As Susan showed, the road was broken up, and I've traveled on the roads that look just like that. But we're also seeing that companies are coming back in, spending, as you can see through the numbers, some pretty hefty numbers of dollars, and repairing those roads or rebuilding some of those roads. And we're hearing from a number of township supervisors about that situation, what that will look like over time. In fact, it's interesting, we also hear from some supervisors that have dealt with gravel roads over time. Now they're ending up with some paved roads, and they're not sure how they're going to maintain a paved road because their budget wasn't set up to deal with that. So a variety of factors that we need to be thinking about. We also see things like sales tax numbers and receipts going up in places where there's lots of wells being drilled. And we're concerned and have a program in place to educate so that we can keep those dollars flowing in those communities, and they're not flowing to Texas or Oklahoma or some other place, but they're actually being spent and being used in that same community. We also track, and we have some new numbers that are emerging for 2011 as we look back, but as we look through the 3 years preceding that, you can see snapshots. Hotel tax is an indicator of how many room stays there are. It's not a perfect indicator, but it gives you some kind of a trend and shows those out there that we've had an influx of people. But we've also now started to see where that workforce is changing, and I'll reference that in just a moment as I start to finish. We also see things like rail. Again, maybe some of those scenarios or pieces of the infrastructure that are just outside of the public eye a lot of times, but we're seeing all the rail siding essentially disappear because it's all been bought up and new rail siding going in, and you can see why. More sand and stone and pipe and a variety of other things coming in by rail that used to be coming in by truck. So there's some offsets there. We're seeing water move more by pipeline now than we are, there's still lots of trucks, but again, we're seeing some of the softening of that impact. And that's due to good planning, and it's due to public pressure, and it's due to a variety of things, but it is occurring out there. Housing would be another one. A variety of data points on that. As it was referenced, it's hard to get. A number of speakers have talked about data in this realm. In a variety of places, we think about what this development looks like, because a lot of it's relatively new. But we have been able to capture some good baseline, and we're working with that baseline and trying to update that over time. Housing is one of those places that we're trying to acquire that. We have a new study that will be coming out very shortly talking about real estate values, using and mining some of the state's data that they've been keeping on that. But we have seen some increases in general in the areas where Marcellus or shale development is going on at a moment in time, a snapshot in time. And as you can imagine, If you're a landowner and own a fair amount of acres in an area, this play is all about who has the most number of acres, the haves and have-nots, so to speak, then you can imagine those parcels have gone up in value, or an influx of people has come in. Supply and demand has increased the value of homes. So rental values, we think about low-income housing. A lot of that's gone off the market, being converted to those that are coming in and are looking to use that same space. So again, changes that are going on and changes within those same communities. Quickly, services, and there were some reflections on this in the previous speaker, but we've done some gauging of this as well through some of my colleagues and some of the work that we've tried to partner on in this, through some of the, and then trying to convey it through some of the outreach effort, but surveying a number of municipalities and government officials, township officials and such, in some yes or no type questions. And again, we have a lot more information behind this, but a couple quick snapshots. Give you an idea, we thought, quite frankly, there would be more of an impact from municipal services and more demands. But this is still on the early side, so we need to emphasize that. It is what it is. It's a snapshot in time, but it does give us some kind of a clue or some kind of an indication of what to expect out there. You start to break that out a little bit more, and we asked actually a number of questions beyond this. You can see, as wouldn't be any big surprise here, road maintenance and construction, but also things like community conflict. I think a lot of that from being a township official myself and dealing with a lot of other township officials, you can measure community conflict in a lot of ways, but I think we're also dealing with a lot of folks that live in those communities and are not participating in the creation of some of that sudden wealth and are feeling some of the pain that would come out of that. So again, a variety of points, and due to time, I'm not going to step through all of them, but one of the things that emphasized, and I think maybe I already did, was about the road repairs and about where those costs are coming from. We can talk about some of these later. The last thing that I want to mention is about workforce, because, again, there was an earlier reference to it, and one of the things, we've actually done some assessments. We've done 4 assessments now, I believe, looking at workforce going as far back as 2008 and actually doing a look beyond, or beyond that, backward from that, to see what was there, and then looking forward and making some projections going out. But we actually based our study or our assessment looking at, it was an assessment done in partnership with academia, done with government agencies, and also done with industry that's hiring, to look at how many workers, and we base this on a per well type basis. So you tell me how many wells there are, we can tell you what the workforce likely is and where that workforce is likely to be associated. So a number of points that we think are important. We also recognize, if you look at the middle part there, the green area, that's where most of the workers are. That's during the actual drilling side. So it's not during that lead up, and it's not during the production when the well is just producing gas over time. Most of that workforce is going to be in that drilling mode. So then the question, as was painted earlier, well, how long is that time frame? So then that ties back to my point about the geology. Well, how many layers of shale are they going to be going after? And how long, and what's the pace? So you go back to the earlier, how many wells per year? And you start to see those things come together, and it helps to answer the question. And it might even help somebody that's thinking about building a hotel, or it might help the local healthcare provider that's trying to decide, well, how many doctors or dentists to hire. Those type of projections can give you some kind of an idea. Again, there are trends that speak to that. We looked or made some assessments. I'm finished. We made some assessments and looked at how that would be when you think about this in different scenarios of 30 or 50 years, and make some assumptions there on the number of wells. Then you can start to see, well, how big would your workforce be, and what can you project, again, as you go over the course of time, what those jobs would actually look like, and what the training is, because we think it's important not only if you're going to be working with us over time and seeing these implications within your communities, what is the educational component that's going to be left or built into those communities to train this workforce, if this workforce is going to emerge as an indigenous workforce versus somebody coming in from Texas or Oklahoma or some other location, as was mentioned. And then the last slide there, just talking about some of the other things that we see. We mentioned about healthcare. We look at the municipal and some of the emergency management issues that have been addressed already. Those all have a cost assigned to them, and who's going to pay those costs? Is it an impact fee or a severance tax, or how are they going to be dealt with, as well as a variety of other considerations, as you can see there. So with that, I'm finished. Thank you.
I know that after lunch, when you're all falling asleep, the subject that you're most excited about is law and the very interesting technical aspects of the law. I will attempt to keep you awake and talk a little bit about how statutes and regulations control some of the impacts that have been discussed today. How do statutes and regulations, for example, prevent fracturing and drilling from contaminating underground resources, or even just the development of a well site from causing erosion that goes into a stream? And the title fracturing regulation applied should really be broader. It should be shale gas development and all other unconventional oil and gas development regulation, because most oil and gas regulation does not apply specifically to hydraulic fracturing. It applies to the many stages of well development that are required for a well to be drilled and hydraulically fractured. And from the legal perspective, I'm not really concerned about whether hydraulic fracturing itself caused an impact or some other stage of the well development process. What I look at is from the construction of a well site all the way through disposal of all of the drilling and fracturing wastes, how are laws and statutes applying to those stages and ensuring that environmental impacts in particular are controlled. And to figure this out, since 2008, I have been surveying various state regulations. I've focused largely on the state level because this is where most oil and gas regulation occurs. I have also spoken with a number of state regulatory officials, and much of this presentation is based on my latest 2 papers, which were funded by the University of Texas. And I'd like to thank my research assistants there at the University of Texas, Chad Davis, Matt Pena, Nikki Pazrija, Molly Wurtzer, Jeremy Shephers, Joel Daniel, and Francis Gradajan for their tireless efforts helping me collect regulations, as well as the enforcements and violations that come out of the regulations on the books. Now, what I will not tell you today, I cannot summarize all of the proposed bills that are currently pending before state legislatures. It already takes almost all of my time just to find the regulations on the books. I can tell you a little bit about the agency regulations and modifications that have been proposed. I also, unfortunately, cannot tell you about North Carolina oil and gas law because I've only so far surveyed about 16 states, and North Carolina is not one of them. But I will tell you briefly about the substance of oil and gas regulation as it applies to hydraulically fractured wells in shales, both shale gas and shale oil, as well as tight sands, and also briefly how those regulations tend to be enforced, because a regulation on the books doesn't mean much if states are not enforcing the regulation. So a brief overview of the regulation of unconventional oil or gas development from the beginning, from the testing of a site for the abundance of oil or gas. It's often called seismic testing, all the way through disposal. I'll give you hopefully a 2-minute summary. At the federal level, federal law applies at the beginning to the development of a well site and the access road to the well site. The Clean Water Act provides controls on stormwater. So when an oil or gas site and the access road is constructed, the operator of that site typically must obtain a stormwater permit under the Clean Water Act, and that controls erosion and sedimentation from the site. A federal law also applies at the construction stage because the operator must ensure that no endangered species will be harmed during the construction of the access road and well site, and if any endangered species might be harmed, the operator has to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to obtain a permit. Federal law also applies at the disposal level. So when produced water comes back up out of the well and flowback water comes back up, the waste itself is not regulated under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act as a hazardous waste. But if the operator wants to dispose of the waste in, say, a stream that is a water of the United States, the Clean Water Act would apply. Also, federal Clean Air Act regulations increasingly apply. Oil and gas operators often are minor sources under the Clean Air Act and therefore not heavily regulated. But the EPA is proposing regulations on air emissions during the flowback phase. As was referenced earlier, the green completion technologies, there has been a notice of proposed rulemaking for federal Clean Air Act regulation. The EPA is also proposing to regulate treatment of the flowback water that comes up from fractured wells, but that regulation is not yet in place. At the regional level, we also have some important regulations. When I refer to regional regulations, I'm talking about states that have gotten together, and under the Compact Clause of the Constitution, they have agreed to regulate certain aspects of environmental law. And with respect to fracturing, what's most relevant is the River Basin Commission model. So the Delaware River Basin Commission, the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, and in a more minor way, there's also a Great Lakes Commission. These entities in the Northeast regulate to varying degrees water withdrawals for fracturing, and in particular, the Delaware River Basin Commission has proposed to regulate well development itself, construction of the well pad, et cetera, because well development can impact the quality of the Delaware River. So the regional commissions currently regulate water withdrawals, and at least one of them has proposed to regulate fracturing and well development more extensively. Now, I'm going to skip briefly to the local level because I'm focusing most of my presentation on states. Localities primarily regulate road use through the road use agreements that Tom mentioned. Also, zoning can be very important. The power of localities to zone oil and gas development and fracturing differs depending on whether those localities have been preempted. They have been preempted in New York and Pennsylvania from regulating certain aspects of oil and gas development. In Texas, in contrast, you tend to see very detailed local regulation of well drilling and fracturing. So Fort Worth, for example, regulates the time at which fracturing may occur. It requires extensive bonding. But on to the states, which have the primary responsibility for controlling the environmental effects of drilling and fracturing. States, most importantly, regulate the construction of the well itself. They regulate how the well must be lined with steel tubing, which is cemented into place. That's called casing. They regulate how deep that casing must go, how strong it must be, and that is an incredibly important role because good casing can prevent gas migration during drilling and then later during fracturing. States also regulate the waste that comes out of the well. I mentioned that the Clean Water Act prevents disposal of the waste into water of the United States without a permit. But states have the majority of control over drill cuttings, flowback water, and produced water. They determine how this waste is handled and often how it is ultimately disposed of. So states put in place requirements for the pits in which these wastes are temporarily stored, whether the pits, the impoundments on the surface must be lined, for example, to keep the contaminants from infiltrating into the soil beneath the pit. And states also regulate if these materials are disposed of on the surface through land application or at a centralized waste disposal facility, what's often called an exploration and production or E&P facility, states provide those standards. Now, if the waste goes into an underground injection control well, we once again have federal regulation coming in under the Safe Drinking Water Act, saying here's how that well must be constructed. And let's not forget what were mentioned earlier, other less formal laws such as standard operating procedures, best management practices that are also affecting the oil and gas development and fracturing and its effects, as well as the common law. There have recently been several lawsuits in Pennsylvania and Texas claiming, for example, that surface pollution and potential underground pollution is a nuisance. So we have many different aspects of the law affecting oil and gas development and fracturing. And when we look at the primary entities that control these effects, the states, we do see some substantial differences. Now, there is a big caveat here. Most state regulators will tell you there are very good reasons for a lot of the differences you see among our regulations. Look at the differences in the formations that are beneath our states, how close those formations are to aquifers, our topography, our climate. We're not so worried about surface pits, for example, if we don't have any precipitation and there's no chance for a surface pit to overflow from rain. So there are, in many cases, scientific reasons for these differences. In other cases, I'm not sure that science is providing that reason. I think further research is needed. But let me just give you a couple examples of state regulations and how they differ. One of the major differences you see is the requirement that a well or a well pad or a well pit or a battery of pits be located a certain distance from natural resources, setback requirements. These differ substantially. Some states have almost no setback requirements. I would probably point to Texas on this one. Texas has a basic requirement that a well be 200 feet from a residence. That's in its state land use laws, but other than that, very few setback requirements. Whereas other states have a variety. I'll just give you an example for setbacks from streams. In Arkansas, you have to have a closed loop system, meaning you have to store your waste in closed tanks rather than surface pits. If you use oil-based drilling mud and you're within 100 feet of a stream, all other wells and pits must be 300 feet from streams. In North Dakota, there's a requirement that no reserve pits may be in or hazardously near bodies of water. It's a more general requirement. Whereas in New York, the proposed supplemental generic environmental impact statement would say the well pad has to be at least 150 feet from a stream. In Ohio, we have a requirement that says no pits in a flooding zone. Lots of different approaches to setbacks and quite a bit of variation in the distance required as well as the language used. Then chemical disclosure. This has been one of the biggest recent changes. Arkansas, Colorado, Louisiana, Montana, New Mexico, New York, North Dakota, Texas, Wyoming, and West Virginia have all either required or proposed to require public disclosure of the chemicals used in fracturing. Note there's a minimal federal requirement in place already that operators have to have material safety data sheets on site, and they have to provide those sheets to local emergency committees. It's just really hard for the public to get access to those. So these disclosure laws are increasing the amount of public access to this information, and one of the biggest recent developments has been to expand disclosure. Interesting industry regulatory partnership here. A lot of the states are requiring disclosure through a website called Frac Focus, which was developed in a collaboration between state regulators, the Groundwater Protection Council, which is an association of state regulators, and industry. So states will say operators must disclose the chemicals they're using at each well on this website, which was created by industry and state regulators. The only state that has required disclosure even of chemicals with trade secrets is, to my knowledge, Texas. Texas still allows operators to maintain trade secrets, to say that certain chemical constituents will not be disclosed, but it allows surface owners and nearby landowners and agencies to appeal that trade secret protection. 2 minutes? Okay. And then in terms of chemicals permitted, Wyoming, I've not seen any other state that has done this. Again, my studies are preliminary. Even though I've been looking at regulations since 2008, I find new ones every day. But I believe that Wyoming is one of the only states that limits the types of chemicals that may be used in fracturing. So Wyoming prohibits the BTEX chemicals, benzene, toluene, ethylene, xylene. States also differ in terms of requirements for flowback storage. The fracking water that flows back up out of the well after you've fractured. Most states here require some form of synthetic liner in a pit to ensure that the chemicals in the flowback water don't get down into the soil or anything else beneath the pit. These requirements differ a bit, though. The states differ in terms of the type of synthetic liner required. It's typically defined by its thickness in mils. So Arkansas, for example, will say the liner has to be 40 mil and it has to have compacted clay, whereas Louisiana says for produced water pits, we have to have the equivalent of 3 continuous feet of recompacted or natural clay. There are a couple of states that, to my knowledge, still do not require lining of flowback pits, but I'd imagine that most industry actors would tell you that industry would line them anyway or use a tank. I might be wrong about that, but I think the liability of not lining a pit is quite high. New York has one of the strictest proposed requirements here. It would require watertight steel tanks for flowback water. I could go on and on about the differences among state regulation. Regulations also differ in terms of how deep the casing of wells must go. Deeply. In some cases, it's defined by feet. In other cases, it's generally defined. So Texas, for example, says there must be just sufficient surface casing to protect all usable quality water, whereas Ohio says you've got to be 50 feet below fresh water. Lots of differences, but let me briefly talk about differences in enforcement. We can look all day at the substance of the regulations on the books and how they differ, but how do states actually implement them? States tend to focus on different types of violations at sites at which hydraulic fracturing has occurred. These are very preliminary analyses. This is an ongoing project, but from violations of environmental regulations at tight sands and shale gas sites, these are the types of violations we are tending to see. And this might mean that operators are causing different types of violations in different states, or that states are just focusing on different issues. Also, maybe states are noticing certain violations and not others. But you'll see here that in Louisiana, we tend to have problems with pit and tank construction, whereas Michigan tends to focus on signs, whether there's a sign identifying the well, for example. And New Mexico, there have been a lot of surface spills noted. Let me just quickly provide a couple of examples of violations. You'll notice that many of these are not associated exactly with the fracturing process. They often come from other stages of the well development process, although you will also see violations that are more specific to fracturing. So in Pennsylvania, for example, there was an ethylene glycol spill to a pad. That ethylene glycol was going to be used in fracturing. The quick summary, by the way, the dollars and penalties assessed also differ quite a bit. Again, this is all preliminary, and if you want to see more data, you can go on the Social Science Research Network and look at my papers, State Enforcement of Shale Gas Regulations and Regulation of Shale Gas Development. The quick message is, it's really tough both to figure out what the comprehensive set of regulations is at the state level, because these regulations are within oil and gas codes, within the environmental codes, land use codes, they're everywhere. And figuring out enforcement is even tougher. A lot of states don't publish enforcement data online. Pennsylvania, on the other hand, has a very comprehensive Excel spreadsheet from recent years of Marcellus violations and enforcements. So as with every other presentation, unfortunately, data are limited. But the takeaway message for me is that states really need to talk to each other. And if they're not talking to each other, we also need the federal government to come in and say, in cases where we have substantial differences among the substance of regulations as well as enforcement, do we need someone higher up to come in and make this consistent, or is there not a one-size-fits-all solution for this particular issue? At minimum, I really think we need to look more closely at how the regulation of environmental effects differs and when and if that's justified, as well as how we can improve regulation at all levels. Thanks.
Again, I just want to remind folks, if they have questions for the speakers, to pass them down. And we'll probably go over a few minutes to ensure that we have some time for Q&A at the end of this session.
Does this work? Hi, everyone. It's okay if it doesn't. That's okay. That's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It works, yay. So I came across this quote from a regional newspaper in Pennsylvania that very simply captures the boomtown scene that I had observed over and over during anthropological fieldwork over the past 2 years. It raises the specter of profound social, economic, political, and environmental changes that have been taking place across rural Pennsylvania. First, slowly, then at lightning speed, the development of the Marcellus Shale has begun to revise people's everyday lives, neighborhoods, and natural environments in significant ways. Conflicts within local communities, families, Pennsylvania, the region, and the nation began to emerge about the risks of hydraulic fracturing and shale gas developments generally, soon after I began this fieldwork that I'll talk about. Much like the ongoing climate change debate, and similar to the previous debate over tobacco and smoking, facts and opinions with regards to shale gas development have been blurred by marketing and advocacy campaigns masquerading as education and news, and have left an ever more confused, fearful, angry, and distrustful public. So bisecting and analyzing the confusion and conflicts that emerge from shale gas developments at the individual and community levels, applied anthropologists and social scientists, such as you've already heard from, as well as myself, hope to eventually offer information that could provide a path out of this confusion and conflict. To achieve this, I applied the study of phenomenology, which is looking at the processes and content of conscious human experience in everyday life, the perceptions, judgments, and emotions, to ask questions about environmental change, conflict, and place. As an applied social scientist with an interpretive and critical orientation towards this issue, I seek to make the analysis, synthesis, and the communication of this complex sociocultural and psychological data available to the public, other scientists, and policymakers in a meaningful, timely, and politically relevant way in order that we may contribute to the deliberations over some of our more pressing environmental problems and intractable conflicts. My work is place-based, and it asks questions about the determinants of environmental values and beliefs, particularly how people ascribe meaning to places and their degrees of attachment to places, and what this may or may not tell us with regards to changing environment or conflicts. The methods I employ involve a qualitative, participatory form of anthropological fieldwork that involves collecting narrative, visual, observational, and archival data. Now, these methodological choices support both my interpretive and my critical social science framework. Participatory inquiry is not only a method of data collection, a very valid one at that, but if implemented successfully, it can also be a tool for social transformation and creating deliberative forms of policy formation and decision-making. So researchers in the Western US began studying the phenomena of what you've already heard about, energy boom towns, around the 1960s. From Colorado, Texas, Utah, Wyoming, California, and the Gulf states, social science and economic studies looked at how small towns and cities, and importantly, sparsely populated rural communities, responded to rapid economic development and population growth. So these studies use socio-demographic, historic, economic, and cultural indicators like rate of population growth, relative isolation of communities, relative size of the population, how communities have previously experienced, or if they had previous experience with energy industries, and existing land ownership regimes. They asked questions such as, are there trends in the changes to quality of life and local governance that are comparable between communities during and after boom times? And what are local residents' attitudes, expectations, and opinions of the boom towns and after? They found certain trends with regards to quality of life, local governance, and social effects that tracked with the economic cycles you'd heard a little bit about before that accompanied the various stages of rapid economic and population growth and decline. The research also found that local residents' attitudes between these places were similar, and they developed models of how local communities could be expected to respond to boom times. Namely, 4 stages of boomtown attitudes were identified: enthusiasm, uncertainty, near panic, and also fear, and adaptation. While some of these previous US studies mention in passing that environmental impacts can be severe, none of them made the link between rapidly changing local environments and local residents' sense of place, culture, or previous responses to conflict that could be unrelated to energy extraction. So the boomtown literature and research also looks at local maladaptation and adaptation. These are important terms. And the responses of communities in an attempt to characterize and generalize these socioeconomic trends. Longitudinal studies show that there are important psychological factors during the pre-boom period that may play a role in determining what socioeconomic researchers call adaptation. 3 of these factors relate to previous experience with the industry, psychological responses, and the ability of locals to process conflicting and complex information. So these previous boomtown studies raise important questions about the long-term impacts of current rapid expansion in Marcellus shale development and other unconventional shale development on local rural communities across the US, and particularly I will focus on the Endless Mountains of the northern tier of Pennsylvania. And they specifically focus around this concept of adaptation, not only during boom times, but I'll also talk about before boom times and after boom times, and after the bust. Hypothetically, a culturally and locally relevant definition of adaptation and the social science economic boomtown definition of adaptation may be quite different. In the socioeconomic literature on boomtowns, adaptation is equated with progress and an acceptance of a situation that's almost beyond local control. In community studies, social work, and ecological science, however, adaptation is seen as a survival strategy, or a set of strategies that leads to community resiliency, sustainability, or evolution. And if a boom period is followed by a bust, where the new industry leaves, the population retracts, jobs dry up, resources are depleted, and perhaps a legacy of pollution or ruined infrastructure is left behind, what exactly does adaptation mean? The preliminary findings presented by this work today begin to address just this first question of pre-boom factors. So you've seen a little bit of this before. Encircled in red here, to jog your memory, is Bradford County. And Bradford County, as you can see from this, has experienced an exponential increase in the number of Marcellus shale gas permits. And this is showing from when I started my work, from 2007 to 2010. My field notes and interviews, though, from 2009 through 2011, are filled with observations and narratives of individual and collective enthusiasm, uncertainty, and panic and fear, the first 3 stages of boomtown attitudes that have already been described from research in the western US. Enthusiasm about how the shale gas would bring new opportunities for employment, income, energy security, and regional growth. Uncertainty as traffic increased, roadways were damaged, local rents tripled, reports of chemical spills and water contamination spread, landowners struggled to understand oil and gas leases and what their rights were, and why they had not been given as good a deal as their neighbors. Employment and new income was not coming on time or in the amount promised for some, but it definitely was for others. And the new gas industry was not generating enough local revenue to keep up with increasing cost in local infrastructure and social programs. Finally, panic and fear has been observed as local lives were lost as a result of traffic accidents. Forest and croplands were converted to well pads, impoundment ponds, compressor stations, or transmission rights-of-way. Transitory gas workers, some non-English speakers, outnumbered locals at area restaurants and grocery stores. The local jails reached capacity. Homelessness split apart families. The number of sexually transmitted diseases rose. The Susquehanna River began bubbling thermogenic methane, which was linked to the drilling of a gas well almost 2 miles away. Drinking water wells, with previously lower levels of methane and some heavy metals, now had elevated levels of methane, barium, strontium, manganese, lithium, and other metals. And there were spills and accidents, such as the one in Leroy Township, Bradford County, which is depicted in the news footage reel from April 2011 here. So by October 2011, the total number of Marcellus gas wells drilled in the county was 1,900. Gas drilling and hydraulic fracturing companies have consumed an estimated 5.7 trillion gallons of water to develop these 1,900 wells. To meet this water demand in Bradford County, by April of 2011, development of an extensive water infrastructure was underway. 33 water withdrawal sites, 85 water impoundment ponds, and an estimated 142 water pipelines that transferred both fresh water as well as recycled wastewater. Officials in the county have estimated that in June 2011, in total area converted from other uses to use by the Marcellus shale gas industry for pipelines, impoundment ponds, new roads, water withdrawal sites, pipe and maintenance yards, and quarries was close to 10,000 acres. If each well pad in the county uses on average 7 acres of land, and each pad had on average 5 wells on it, that would mean that the current 1,900 wells drilled are using approximately 2,660 acres. So a very conservative and rough estimate is that a total of approximately 12,225 acres had been converted from some other use to gas industry use in Bradford County. So I moved to Bradford County in January of 2010 to begin field work and organize focus groups to document local agricultural landowners' perspectives and relationships with the Susquehanna River. Actually, not much to do with Marcellus shale, I thought. I soon realized that the environment, economic, and social changes that I was observing and documenting daily were rapidly overwhelming county government and changing how residents experience their daily lives. From a migrant workforce needing places to live, to tractor trailers and heavy equipment clogging and destroying roads. As one interviewee in 2010 so poignantly described, if these trucks were all painted green, you would think we were being invaded. What he was describing to me was how the place he had chosen to call home and open a business was now being invaded by the shale gas industry. It became immediately clear that the research I was conducting could contribute to the study of energy boomtowns. However, my approach as a qualitative practitioner was quite different from those previous studies. Instead of socioeconomic variables and psychological metrics, my work relies on the rigorous, systematic study of sociocultural phenomena. Central to this work are the concepts of conflict and sense of place. Conflict being the product of local everyday negotiations over the interpretation of places, concepts, and problems. For example, the interviewee who felt invaded by trucks interpreted them as an occupying force, and his personal response to that force had been to sell his business, move from the county, and avoid confrontation. To others, however, who also interpret the trucks as an occupation, that response could and has been different. For instance, some see it as an opportunity to join the occupation and get a job in trucking. Others see it as an occupation to be overthrown by public interest or legal challenge. And the other concept, sense of place, in this study, looks at the phenomena of individuals and groups of individuals ascribing social meaning or interpretations to places and their negotiation over those interpretations. For instance, as a place comes from a rural area to an industrial landscape. This concept treats place as an agent, a relationship, and a process. And the stories and words of longtime families in Bradford County, such as the daughter of the farmer who took these pictures, place is seen as a family member, a childhood memory, a spiritual retreat, a sacred item, as well as a physical and economic burden. So, population statistics prior to the Marcellus shale gas boom portrays a place that was rural, losing population, poorer compared to the rest of the state and the region, racially homogeneous, and retiring on older age. And the county encompasses close to 740,000 acres, just to give you a sense of scale. Agriculture and forestry have been central to Bradford County's landscape and identity of the county's residents for centuries. Recent evidence is from this brochure developed by the county just before the shale gas boom in the early 2000s. And unlike northwestern and southwestern parts of Pennsylvania, where oil and gas had been commercially produced since before 1900, the northeastern part of Pennsylvania has only experienced commercial oil and gas development within the last 30 to 60 years. The majority of livestock and crop farmers interviewed for this research said they had a gas lease on their lands for at least the last 30 years, although they had never been drilled on or under as far as they knew. A modified focus group methodology using participatory inquiry, participant-generated GIS maps, and photographic essays was developed to allow landowners to document their own unique experiences and give them a way to communicate these experiences with us, the researchers, the broader public, and decision makers. Open-ended and structured questions were used during focus groups to encourage the identification of individual and group objectives, engage in meaningful conversations, develop maps and photographic essays, and share openly and honestly their opinions, values, beliefs, feelings, and experiences, and expectations. The intensive focus group meetings with agricultural and forest landowners during the winter of 2009 through the summer of 2011, combined with continuing monthly group meetings with these same landowners, interviews with an additional 98 county residents, and 24 months of participant observations are the basis of this study's preliminary findings. So, preliminary findings reveal culturally relevant quality of life indicators that are important to understanding how local residents view the place they live and work and what keeps them there. This research has also uncovered relationships and attachments to place that keep landowners tied to their lands and Bradford County. Data reveals genealogical, spiritual, or ideological reasons that landowners feel what they even call themselves rooted to the place and the community they live, and may give us some idea about why certain residents choose to leave the area or to stay. There is also striking evidence that landowners are experiencing symptoms of collective trauma, paralleling those found in communities where natural and human-caused disasters have taken place. One of the best-known studies in the US of the psychological and social response to such disasters was conducted by Kai Erickson with communities in Buffalo Creek, West Virginia, after a coal dam flood destroyed entire towns in the 1970s. Erickson describes collective trauma as, quote, a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damages the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of community. Interviewees in focus groups and individually equated new feelings they were experiencing as a result of changes taking place in their community since the shale gas industry arrived with death and a tangible, sometimes physical response to pending loss. As one landowner described, it feels like we're losing our love. The things we love the most may be taken away. And one other preliminary finding that warrants further investigation is the rampant misunderstanding and ignorance of rural farming culture. Whether resulting from misrepresentation in media, among experts, or non-farming communities, these representations translate into wider public misunderstanding of ways of life and beliefs with regard to farmers' interactions with the gas industry. So in conclusion, what can these preliminary findings tell us about the psychological and sociocultural factors that may be operating in the Endless Mountains of Pennsylvania that could make them more or less resilient to energy boomtown changes? First, with regards to previous boomtown studies, results from this study give us a picture of a community that may not adapt very well to these changes. The Endless Mountains in Bradford County in particular has no previous knowledge of the shale gas industry, exhibits large fluctuations in psychological and social responses to change. Local residents have poor access to complete, accurate information, both in terms of basic infrastructure and telecommunications, as well as content, as we've discussed here today. And residents have little or no willingness to participate in local planning, perhaps as a result of the lack of pre-existing established processes for community involvement in the first place. What this study contributes is perhaps a way to reconcile some of these factors that may be making it difficult for Bradford County to be resilient in the face of rapid change. These preliminary findings show that individuals, when asked and given the chance to reflect, have a clear sense of what aspects of local place and community are important to them and others, and that they have a very rooted attachments in some cases to place and community that are important to them and others, and that may actually reinforce their willingness to stay in the area despite changes. This in turn has prompted landowners involved in the study to act on these values by becoming more active participants in local planning and to seek out the best information available to educate themselves and their neighbors about the gas industry. However, the very real evidence of collective trauma and abuse that is emerging from this study should give us all pause. Whether it's dredging up of past traumas in the community unrelated to gas drilling, or completely novel and related to the gas drilling, how will these emotional responses affect the community's ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances? And finally, perpetuating outsider misunderstandings and lack of appreciation for the cultural ways of life and beliefs of rural Bradford County landowners may lead to further alienation of the community and exacerbate feelings of trauma and abuse. And just one quick note on continuing research. I just wanted to add one thing, and I won't go through the rest, but one of the really important things that we're asking in continuing this project is how adaptation to rapid socioeconomic and environmental change is defined in local culturally relevant terms. Is the locally relevant definition of adaptation synonymous with individual and community resiliency or sustainability, or is it, as previous Boomtown studies seem to define, acceptance of change and progress beyond local control? And I also just want to mention, since she's walking, we also have long-term ethnographic plans to do this project and psychology studies. And there's ongoing work across North America on this type of work with Canada. Thank you.
Yeah, let's come up to the table. I know we're running over, but I want to give the audience about 10 minutes to ask questions, and if folks need to leave, that's also, we'll understand, but I know there's a lot of questions, so I want to make sure we have a few minutes. Oh, we have more? Ooh, wow, you've been hiding them. Okay, can you hear me from over here? So I'm going to try to have the questions be a little bit more general and just ask a few questions that everybody could comment on briefly. This is for everyone. It's from Stacy Dugan. Do you have any recommendations on how municipalities can protect themselves from the environmental risks of fracking? So it's a very broad question, and in some ways hopefully can help sum up what many of you have been saying. Essentially, you know, what are some of the safeguards that communities could actually put into place at the municipal level? Yeah.
I would say that the communities are taking steps to protect themselves. I've been working this year on a study looking at community responses, and we now have a database of about 72 communities that are attempting to take steps to regulate natural gas drilling. As I said in my talk, I think that it's very important to control the pace and scale of drilling, and that is going to have to be done through the permitting process at the state level. That will affect how intense these kinds of impacts are that Simone was describing. So I think that there has to be action, political action, legislation at the state level, and then communities have to be able to learn from one another and enact local regulation.
I think one of the things that, oh yeah, briefly, there's, you're just trying to shut me up, aren't you?
No, I just want to make sure that we go.
No, I'm just joking. I think one of the things that we've seen at the county level, at least in the places where there's so much development going on, is a real strain on resources in terms of personnel. We've found that conservation districts and actual county workers have been hired away by the industry, and there's no money there at the local level to actually hire back people who they need to do this work because they can't compete in terms of salaries with the industry, with the new gas industry. So that's something to plan for, to be aware of that at the local community governance level.
And I have to rudely leave to catch a flight to teach, but a couple of good local examples, I think, come from Fort Worth and Arlington, Texas. Those ordinances are available online. Several municipalities in New Mexico have also implemented relatively comprehensive codes which require everything from, for example, environmental liability insurance through controls on the lights and the noise associated with fracturing. There are lots of legal examples there, and I am going to rudely run in the middle of this. I'm sorry.
Fine.
Can I mention several things?
Sure.
Okay, I would mention 3 different things. I think good education, and I think all of us would agree around the concept that people need to be educated as to what this process looks like, what the potential impacts are, and what some of those issues associated with it could be, so that they can mitigate any potential downside and enjoy any potential benefit that would come out of it. Again, a variety of people have spoken to that today. I think the other piece would be good planning. So the outcome of all that education would be being an active part of the planning process, again, trying to mitigate any potential downside that would show up there. And I think the last piece there would be just that overemphasis on that involvement piece. Being involved in the dialogue all the way through the process, start to finish, so that you can see what it looks like right now, and seeing it firsthand, and knowing where the story is at the current moment. So in other words, not just researching something and knowing what it was, but knowing where it is at the moment, what rules and regs have been changing and evolving over time, and what's pending in the near future, so that you can participate in that part and help it to move and advance regs and some of the environmental components would be attached thereof.
Okay, great. This is another question that is for the whole panel, but it comes from Susan, you leading off with talking about fewer jobs being created in the natural gas drilling. Even just speaking to the jobs that are being created, can you speak about the quality and safety of those jobs? Also, what effects might subsequent industries, such as manufacturing and steel, have on the health, environment, and other aspects of the community in the affected areas? So commenting on employment and job opportunities.
I'm a manufacturing matters person. I'll just say that right out there. I want to return manufacturing back to the United States. And if this supports that, helps it move forward, I think that is a positive side of that. That said, I think that if we can see more of what we've seen in Youngstown, Ohio, with the pipeline and steel industry growing, I think that's a positive aspect of this development. That said, I think that the jobs that are provided are dangerous jobs in the drilling crews. There's also an assumption, and I was reminded of this by Tom's presentation, there's an assumption that these jobs will be permanent to the regions in which they occur, the drilling regions. Now, you have to think about this. These are drilling crews. Right now, they operate out of Tulsa and Texas because they're crews and these people know each other, and these are difficult jobs. They come into a place, and maybe if the industry lasts in that place, in that region for 10 years, there may be some people who get jobs on those drilling crews. But when those drilling crews move to Bakken, or they move to another shale play, those people from Pennsylvania are going to have to go with those crews. So the question is, what kind of longer-term jobs are we really getting with this industry? We're going to get a lot of service jobs. And people in Tulsa and Texas need to work too. But I think that the question becomes one of whether the regions and places where this is going to occur are going to have to take one for the team. And economists always say that the cost of resource extraction should be part of the the total cost, these costs to the place where the drilling takes place. I think that's one of the things we've been trying to get across, that this has to make sense for the regions where the drilling will occur.
Exactly. And to that, can I say something quick about that point? I was recently on a conference call with some folks from Colorado who are working on this USDA project to look at agricultural transitions. And one of the things the people from Colorado emphasized, the local government folks, the county commissioners, was that, to Pennsylvania and New York, this is not going to create permanent jobs in your area. You can actually create a permanent workforce training facility in your area, but you can't expect all those people to stay there because this is a transient industry, right? And I just wanted to emphasize that, and that's an important point, very important.
Tom?
I was just going to mention about the safety side, because it is something that we've been involved in as an educational provider. We have a branch of our university that's been very deep in the workforce development aspect relative to this. One of the things that's been very key in all those discussions, as you see thousands of people now that have gone through that process, is the safety aspect of it. So that is a very important consideration. I think we need to put some emphasis on that here. There we're talking about the human safety aspect to make sure that they're well trained in going through that process from a workforce standpoint. Right. We also see that from an environmental standpoint as they go through the second step, then with the companies that they're working for. And I think that, again, is another consideration that needs to be applied here.
Okay, so I'm going to take one more question for the panel and then close. We're going to close the session. But I'm going to actually take 3 questions that are up here and combine them into one. And it has to do with essentially the revenue that is generated from shale gas drilling. And one of the questions asks, are there any good examples of how gas revenues are managed, and who oversees the revenue that is generated? Does it go into local coffers? Are local governments better suited to administer these funds? And so looking at essentially where the profits are going, who's benefiting, what best practices have been put into place, and the social impacts of the revenue that is being generated at the tax level, but also within community infrastructure. Is trying to bring all that together briefly to comment on a very large subject.
Well, I can say something. Penn State has done some very interesting and valuable work on this subject, but this subject of the taxation and the revenues is very similar to the subject of regulation. It can be done differently in one state and from another. So if you have a state like Wyoming, all the revenues collected at the state level, and then they distribute only a very small portion of it to the localities where the drilling takes place, but much of that drilling is done on public land. Pennsylvania doesn't have a state severance tax. Texas has both state taxes and local taxes, and so this can vary from one state to another. The big dispute in the tax area is the distribution of the taxes between the state, which also has its costs, and the localities which experience the greatest costs. How is that distribution going to be made? Does the state get all the revenue and redistribute it, or do localities get the majority of the revenue?
I would comment as well, too. One of the things that we've tried not to do, being a university, is there's a political question here. There's no question about that. And in trying to sort that out. And we've tried to stay out of that arena because we don't try to answer that political question. What we've tried to do is the research to come up with some of the data points that then those same legislators would use as they determine what the formula would be, or what the tax would be, or impact fee would be, whatever, assuming that there is one. And there's not one in motion, or there's not one in place at the moment, there's one in motion. So we've tried to do the research to assess that. We've worked with municipalities, we've worked with different associations within the state to try to determine, well, what are the actual impacts? Some are very easy to determine, things like roads, for instance, or things to to, within the municipality itself that would be very, very apparent, certainly with population changes and some of those aspects. But we've also tried to look behind the scenes. Healthcare would be a good example in trying to look, well, what is the impact of the local emergency rooms? Is there an impact? And if there is, who's paying for that? And what is it like to bring new healthcare providers in? Is there an issue with that or isn't it? What about tourism? Again, some of the other points that were mentioned here. So we've tried to acquire that data, and then those are using it as they sort that out and make some of the political decisions that they're trying to make relative to what the costs attached to those or how those costs are going to be refunded back in within those communities. So there is clearly in Pennsylvania, as we're seeing, as there would be in any place, a local impact or a local fee or some sort of a local cost that's associated with that, as well as a statewide cost, and that's the part that we're trying to help sort out.
I don't think I think I had.
Okay, so I want to thank everyone for attending this workshop today, and I'm assuming some of the panelists up here will hang out for a few minutes if you have any additional questions, but thank you all.